I played Dragon Age Veilguard, so you don't have to. Maybe it was a mistake playing Dragon Age right after playing Metaphor Fantagio, but when you have articles and journalists giving this game like a 10 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 and saying that this is Game of the Year material and whatever, I didn't think I would have an insane low after playing Metaphor, which is 10 times better than Dragon Age Veilguard. But if Veilguard is 10 out of 10, does that make Metaphor a 20 out of 10? No, it means the journalists are lying again. They did this with Star Wars Outlaws and Black Myth Wukong, and they're doing it again with Dragon Age Veilguard. This game, at best, is a 6 out of 10. I played through the entire game and it took me 45 hours to get through all 14 chapters. Look, I never played the other Dragon Age games. The last Dragon Age game came out in 2014, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I was 12. And yes, I do agree that games should evolve over the years, but it doesn't feel like the Dragon Age I expected. My first Kingdom Hearts game was Kingdom Hearts 3, and it felt like a Kingdom Hearts game. My first Final Fantasy game was 13, and it felt like a Final Fantasy game even with its flaws. Even as a new player in the franchise, I love fantasy games, I love RPGs, and when journalists score this like a 9 or higher, I should at least have my money's worth or find something enjoyable about the game. Right? The story is probably the worst thing about the game. The writing is atrocious. The main plotline, very lackluster. The characters are boring. It's just hard to want to care about the story if the story is very hard to understand. Now again, I have not played any of the Dragon Age games, but I did recognize the story structure. The game's story structure is essentially Mass Effect 2, and Mass Effect 2 is a great game. I loved it, made by the same company too. A catastrophic disaster is coming soon, and you, as the player, need to recruit people with a specific talent or specialization that will help you do an impossible, essentially, suicide mission at the very end. Now, when we have something where the stakes are high like that, I should assume the overall story is going to have like a serious tone and some grit to it. No, the only time someone is angry or the tension is elevated is when someone misgenders someone. Really? Come on. I couldn't care less if there's a non-binary person or not, but when it feels like things are centered around real-life social or real-life political issues in a fantasy video game, it feels off-putting and it feels less real. Oh, but fantasy is not real to begin with. Why do people like the fantasy genre? Without going on a crazy tangent, when the fantasy is portrayed, 75% of it could be real, but the other 25% is magic, which is ironic as it's labeled fantasy. And because of this, it feels very immersive because this fantasy world is a very cool place to be in. A game like Metaphor was very immersive and there was like an invisible hand that popped out of my monitor and pulled me in. Whereas Dragon Age Veilguard felt invasive. That invisible hand was there, but instead it was coming out of the monitor and into the real world. That's weird. And I emphasize immersion in a lot of my reviews, and when it's not immersive, I just don't care. Sure, there's things to appreciate like combat or whatever, but it's not something I'm willing to lose sleep for. And so I lost interest in the overall story probably 5 hours in. The writing itself feels like it's level 1 kindergarten writing. They just say how it is. No metaphors, no similes, no thinking required. They just say how it is. It's so low level, it's so boring, it's so basic, I just did not like it. There were probably a few exceptions, like Solus I believe, but I tuned out of the story, I'm sorry. I didn't want to lose any brain cells and my brain turning into mush. I think, especially when you're in the classical fantasy setting, you should have like some highbrow Lord of the Ring like level literature and dialogue. It will make it much better and much more inspiring and more immersive. But it's not, so when it feels like I'm putting into a classroom full of first graders, it feels patronizing when talking about social or political topics because the game makes me feel like an idiot, and no one enjoys feeling like an idiot in any capacity of context. As my game was downloading, I quickly looked up the romance options because that would determine the gender of the character I was going to make. If there was a hot girl, I would have made a character that looks like me. If there wasn't, I was going to make a hot girl myself. Unfortunately, none of those happened. I made the ugliest girl I have ever made. Now, the problem is mostly me. I suck at character customization. The game didn't really make someone like me that sucks at it to be able to make a decent character relatively fast. To make a good character, it takes several hours, I believe. I think I read somewhere that it took this one person 25 hours to create her character. Now, I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. The character she made was really good, but if it takes 25 hours to do that, there might be a problem with it. I think the cast for Veilguard is not interesting at all, and even worse, they are annoying. Ironically, the casts like Pet, like Hassan and Manfred, were my favorites. Maybe because they didn't speak English and I thought they were funny. Everyone else, terrible. Balara, too much. Harding, too tropey. Neve is boring. Emmerich is out of place from the cast. Devrin is just a stereotype I just don't like in any game. Tosh is trash and annoying. And Lucanus could have been better if they just allowed us to make him more evil. And so when the story structure, like I said earlier, is very similar to Mass Effect 2, what went wrong? In Mass Effect 2, you had Garrus, Miranda, Grunt, Mordin, Tali, Legion, Jack, Thane, Kasumi. Mass Effect 2 came out 14 years ago. I know I'm comparing apples and oranges, but they're both fruits. They're both made by Bioware. So why does it feel like we're devolving into a state where Dragon Age Veilguard is right now? And I know there are some people that do like the cast of Dragon Age Veilguard, but for me, as a newcomer into the series, I didn't like any of the characters in this game. The graphics is off theme, I think. Now, my preconceived idea of what the graphics should be is something with grit. Maybe not as dark or gritty like Act 2 of Baldur's Gate, but I didn't expect Veilguard to be so saturated. I'll admit, the landscape and skyboxes are visually cool, but I do think the textures for character models and textures on surfaces like floors and walls when it's raining are too glossy. I think I explained it well. So the graphics on how it is, I think it's mostly good, but it's not something I like for a game like Dragon Age. Now, I love saturation in my cel-shaded JRPGs, but for a realistic-ish graphic like Dragon Age, it feels weird and it feels kind of kiddish. Even areas with blight is missing something that would make them feel evil or gritty or tense. It's just very saturated and it doesn't feel like a mature game, if that makes sense. The very saturated colors and glossy textures is something that I would see in like a cozy farming sim or something similar. Not in a game called Dragon Age, where you'll be fighting dragons and zombie-like creatures. The combat is nothing too special in my opinion. From what I gathered, it's a direction change from the previous entry, Inquisition, and is more action-based rather than its tactical predecessor. I don't think the change is a bad thing, just look at Final Fantasy. I think it's only natural for games to evolve over time. I don't know how tactical the previous entries were, but I do think that the strategy element is not present anymore. It's just a numbers go up, therefore I am better. Which isn't bad, but when the combat is solely based around just almost button mashing, it can get stale pretty fast. There are 3 classes that you can play as, Rogue, Mage, and Warrior, and each class has 3 subclasses, such as for the Rogue, it's Duelist, Saboteur, and Veil Ranger. I played as an elf who specialized as a rogue Veil Ranger because I wanted to shoot arrows, plain and simple. And honestly, I think I picked the wrong class. This may not be a problem for everyone, obviously, because I think Bioware put out some data already, like 70% of the people picked either Mage or Warrior, and so assuming there's an even split within the rogue class, only 10% of the population picked Veil Ranger. Especially since I tried making my build centered around using my bow, it felt like I could never achieve that Legolas fantasy of decimating armies with a bow. There was a point where I did feel powerful, and that was when I got like a mythic level bow, maybe around 2/3 of the way through the game, but then it was clearly underpowered towards the final stretch. I think just the way the combat is just doesn't work with a pure bow or ranged playstyle, even on Veil Ranger specialization. I didn't do any melee combat, but I would assume it's probably the most ideal way to play, as there are mechanics like parrying and staggers. Pairing is pretty easy, as the parry windows are very forgiving, and staggers, at least for me, didn't really happen that often, but I was doing a ranged build and I'd imagine it's easier to do all these mechanics on a melee build. Along with your own 3 skills and ult, you can also use your companion skills during a fight. You essentially pause the game and target an enemy and assign your companion's ability to it. It's pretty basic, and their cooldowns are longer than I'd want them to be, and it also sucks that it fully pauses the game in an action-oriented game like this. I mean, overall the combat could be fun, but because the cooldowns are long and there's very little enemy diversity, it gets very stale very fast. I wouldn't consider this game to be open world. Each world is pretty linear and long. The chests are something like you just take 10 steps away from the main path, so it's nothing too special. Like I said before, the backdrops are nice to look at, but the areas themselves aren't that memorable. There's no landmarks really, or history within the areas. It's usually just a matter of getting to point A to point B, and the journey to get there looks the same and isn't all that enjoyable. That, along with no enemy diversity, it makes traveling very boring and very formulaic. You're fighting the same enemies within the same set of trees and rocks as you walk across the zone to kill the boss and end the quest. In fact, a lot of the quests and objectives are very formulaic, and I found myself doing the same thing over and over again, both on a micro level, such as the way I fight enemies, where I just headshot the same enemy unit like 3 times, then use the skill and repeat. And also on a macro level, track a new quest, fast travel to the world, talk to the person, follow the path, finish the quest, go back to the hub, repeat. It's a lot of repetition with no variance, which makes it very predictable. And when something is predictable, it gets boring and tedious. Dragon Age Veilguard is not a terrible game, but it's definitely not as good as what journalists are making it to be. The writing was written by a first grade teacher for their 6-year-old students. It's low level, it's patronizing, and it's just boring. Which is surprising, especially when this is an M-rated game, meaning it's for people that are 18 plus. The characters are straight up annoying, uninteresting, and feel pointless most of the time. The overall story structure is very similar to Mass Effect 2, which came out 14 years ago, but is somehow much worse, almost as if they forgot what they did right with that game. Normally, a good game would make you feel immersed into its world, meaning that you, as a player, would want to be in that world. But Dragon Age Veilguard feels invasive as the characters and its ideals are trying to enter my own personal world, and that's just weird. The combat is a bit more manageable, but it's very repetitive when fighting the same enemy type over and over again in the same hallway or arena over and over again. And as someone who has never played a Dragon Age game before, I don't want to go back on the previous entries of the franchise. Veilguard has tainted my desire to explore the fantasy world under the Dragon Age umbrella, and definitely from future Dragon Age games, if they ever do. The screenshots of this game may look pretty, but beneath that oversaturation and glossy textures, a horrible experience that I would not wish any of my enemies to go through. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe to this video if you like this type of content. I do have a video lined up for the end of this month where I rank every new game that I have played that was released this year. And so far, I have played 25 games from this year and counting, so there will be a lot to rank. Leave a comment down below and come join the Discord in the link below that I'm active in. See you guys later.